I would not say I am a philosopher, except that all poets are flowery philosophers. I like to consider myself a poet playing with the epic of life. My pictures and poems are not for philosophical purposes. They are not calculated to run home a truth. If they have beauty, sorrow, love, and energy in them, so that they stir the faculty of wonder in the onlooker, they have utility. Wonder is the beginning of all discovery. Rose Cecil O'Neill was a self-taught illustrator, sculptor, fine artist, poet, novelist, creator of Kewpie dolls, activist, and philanthropist. Her impact resonated through her popular magazine illustrations created in what was a profession dominated by men, through her creation of the popular Kewpie character and dolls, and from the often bold and unconventional path she laid for herself. Defying all stereotypes, O'Neill was a nonconformist who shunned corsets for long flowing robes, noting, "I was always rebellious against harness and hairpins." She was tireless in efforts to obtain the right for women to vote, and this year we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which affirms that right. Rose O'Neill was born in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania in 1874. She wrote that her father had built an emerald cottage for his wife, whom he adored. Though a thoughtful sentiment, the construction left them penniless, and they were forced to relocate just a few years later. The family settled in the prairie land of rural Nebraska, where they lived in a sod house built by her father. As a young child growing up like so many homesteaders, the floor of their house was made of dirt. However, her parents inspired her spirit of exploration and creativity. Her mother focused on music lessons, while her father encouraged her to study the arts and literature. She recalled when she was 11 a conversation in which her father told her mother, "Give me this child. I want to make an experiment, specialize. She shall have no studies except those conducive to the arts." O'Neill remembered, "There were all sorts of art books in my father's library. The horrors of William Hogarth came near to darkening my spirit, but I would forget him when I turned to Michelangelo and Leonardo." He also had a book of anatomist John Flaxman's drawings in the works of Homer, and albums of photographs and steel engravings of Greek statues and architecture. O'Neill's father took her to performances of plays by Shakespeare, and she often spent her free time drawing in bed, inspired by Homer's epics The Iliad and the Odyssey. The cultural immersion she experienced early in life would resound throughout her life's work. She was relentless in her desire to learn, draw, and explore. At the age of 13, O'Neill entered a drawing competition held by the Omaha World Herald newspaper. She titled her work, "Temptation Looking Down into an Abyss." O'Neill noted the editors summoned her to the newspaper's offices to prove the drawing was her own creation. Upon arriving, O'Neill found the editors poring over the work of French illustrator Gustave Doré. After proving her ability in person, she won the award, a $5 gold piece. O'Neill continued to hone her craft during her teenage years and had her work published in numerous regional newspapers. As she matured, she grew increasingly eager for new experiences, and at the age of 19, she moved to New York City, where opportunities for the confident, skilled artist were boundless. After arriving in New York, O'Neill found residence in a convent run by the Sisters of St. Regis. The sisters insisted on accompanying young Rose to interviews, although the artist quickly found illustration work in the pages of Life, Harper's Bazaar, Cosmopolitan, Good Housekeeping, and other magazines. A comic strip O'Neill wrote, titled The Old Subscriber Calls, was printed in the September 19, 1896 issue of Truth, notable for being the first published comic strip created by a woman. The following year, she joined the staff of Puck, where she was the only woman working until 1903. O'Neill signed her early work R.C. O'Neill, which led many of Puck's female fans to assume she was a male cartoonist. She recalled, "The public thought I was a man, and before the truth came out, I received an abundance of letters, often with locks of hair." O'Neill's work was admired by readers and fellow artists alike, and her drawings frequently appeared in the magazine. Though illustrations of members of high society may seem a mismatched subject for a young artist from rural Nebraska, O'Neill quickly learned how to please her audience. Artists Charles Dana Gibson and Harrison Fisher had been very successful with stylistic images of society figures, most notable in the former artist's Gibson Girls, which represented the ideal female elegance of the time. In 1896, Rose O'Neill married a handsome bon vivant named Gray Latham. She began signing her work O'Neill Latham. Although he was from a wealthy Virginia family, Latham's gambling habit, frequent trips to collect O'Neill's income from her magazine submissions, and squandering of her money took a toll on their marriage. She divorced Latham in 1901. While her marriage to Latham was nearing its end, O'Neill began receiving affectionately written anonymous letters. The source of the letters was Harry Leon Wilson, editor at Puck magazine. After a brief affair, they were married in 1902. Though Wilson was a talented author, O'Neill later recalled his bouts of melancholy. His inability to find relief for what appears to have been clinical depression doomed their marriage, and they were divorced in 1907. After enduring 2 unpleasant marriages and divorces in just over a decade, O'Neill proved she was anything but typical. Undeterred, she continued to create popular drawings, the subjects of which would soon substantially alter the course of O'Neill's life. O'Neill's most popular creation was born in 1909, although similar figures had appeared in her work for years. The Kewpies, named after Cupid, the Roman god of love, were childlike, winged, elfish creatures sporting a top-knot hairstyle. The Kewpies were an instant success. The Kewpies appeared in Good Housekeeping magazine during numerous holidays, including April Fool's Day, May Day, Halloween, Christmas, and New Year's. O'Neill noted her intent for creating the Kewpies was to do good deeds in a funny way. The world needs to laugh, or at least smile more than it does. In 1912, O'Neill began creating Kewpie dolls through a factory in Germany. As an artist who had been raised in a sod house, O'Neill insisted the dolls should be accessible to every child. She chose numerous sizes and prices for Kewpie dolls. The cheapest was just a nickel. She noted, "The smallest Kewpie at first didn't turn out as pretty as he should have. I told the workman he ought to be the very best, because he was for poor children." In lieu of a lump sum payment for the sale of the dolls, O'Neill requested a royalty for each doll sold. The vast number of dolls sold netted her an estimated $1.4 million, $35 million in 2020 when adjusted for inflation. O'Neill was more popular than ever, and her work was featured in magazine illustrations, books, and advertisements for numerous companies, including Eastman Kodak, Rock Island Railroad, Kellogg's Corn Flakes, and Jell-O, which also employed famed illustrator Maxfield Parrish. While living with her sister Callista at an apartment in New York City's Greenwich Village, O'Neill became involved with the women's suffrage movement. She marched in parades, gave speeches, and illustrated posters for the movement. She recalls her first speech on behalf of women's suffrage. "One Sunday evening, I had been at an anti-suffrage meeting uptown and had stopped off at Madison Square, where I saw a crowd gathered about a platform. 2 of the suffrage workers immediately asked me if I would hold the crowd until the next speaker arrived. I went up on the platform to make my first and only suffrage speech. I began well, for I was introduced as the mother of the Kewpies to thunderous applause. I began by telling about the anti-meeting I had just seen. I felt very gay and enjoyed turning it into ridicule. I was soon aware that my audience was with me. There were waves of laughter like a wind passing over corn. I've forgotten what my arguments were, but I remember they were all on the humorous side. As I walked home, I felt as if I was walking on air. I was full of a sense of power. In an interview published on October 24, 1915, O'Neill said the idea for an exhibition of suffrage art was suggested to her when a Kewpie whispered in her ear, "Why not a street exhibition of us?" O'Neill created this image for the exhibition, which took place at Broadway and 42nd Street. As a suffragette and artist, O'Neill took advantage of the Kewpies' popularity in her political illustrations. They often noted the negative impact the lack of voting rights placed on young women, and emphasized the important role women played in society and family life. The 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1870. Although it guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, women were still denied voting rights. After passing through Congress on June 4, 1919, and receiving the necessary approval of 3/4 of the states on August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment was officially ratified by the U.S. Secretary of State on August 26, 1920. The amendment states, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." In 1921, O'Neill debuted her first exhibition of fine art and sculpture in Paris. She had first visited Europe in 1905 and remained there for 2 years to formally study art. As the Kewpies were taking on a life of their own, O'Neill began developing thematic works she titled Sweet Monsters. These drawings became the focus of her 1922 book of poetry titled The Master Mistress. On her change in style, she noted, "I seemed to be entranced by the idea of the rise of man from animal origins, and was always drawing low, slant-browed beings that pointed the road beyond us. These beings charmed me. While I drew them, I had ecstatic images of the upsurge of life from the ancestral slime. This progression seemed to me the epic of epics." As O'Neill's fame and fortune grew, she entertained artists, authors, and celebrities at the homes she now owned in New York City, Connecticut, villa on the Isle of Capri, and the property where her family now resided on 300 acres of Missouri land she named Bonnybrook. Her guests included Thomas Hart Benton, James Montgomery Flagg, Khalil Gibran, and Booth Tarkington. In a profile from 1934, reporter Alexander King wrote, "Rose's boundless hospitality attracted new hosts of aesthetes. It is a well-established fact that guests invited for a weekend remained 2 years. Her legendary generosity became the keynote of her life, and today, at 60, it is still her greatest charm and most fatal indulgence." By the mid-1930s, O'Neill had lost nearly all of her savings to lavish living and the economic toll of the Great Depression. Her Sweet Monster works had not achieved the success she had anticipated, and the popularity of Kewpies had dissipated over time. In 1894, her family had moved from Nebraska to the Ozark region in Missouri, and in 1898 her father began building Bonnybrook, their new home. During the early 1930s, O'Neill spent more time at her beloved Bonnybrook and began living there full-time in 1936. O'Neill had begun writing the manuscript for her autobiography when she died in 1944. In the manuscript, she recalled seeing the first Kewpie dolls being made. Bright sunlight fell on their jolly little rondeurs, proving them to be true. They had all the necessary dimensions. They could be touched, encircled by the fingers, hugged. The children who had written to me were to have their Kewpie that could be held in the hand. But there was more. The little round faces were telling me something. The sidelong eyes, the smile. The anguish of the night was dissolved. I thought, while there is anything at once so funny and so loving, there is hope. Love and the laugh, the invincible pair.
In the apartment above me, there is the lovingest pair. I don't know what she has to be jealous of. She has a face that just a mother could love. And still I know she's always worried some girl will steal her prize away. She's always asking, is there somebody else? I guess it's just to hear him say, no, no, Nora, nobody but you, dear. You know, Nora, yours truly is true, dear. When you accuse me of flirting, I couldn't, I love you so. I have chances, too many to mention. Never give them a bit of attention. And would I trade you for thee?